G'day, I'm Owen, you've joined the pub test, and we are looking at a very interesting theory in the Jack the Ripper saga. The central character, and that's why the title talks about Louis DiemSchutz. There are other people involved, as we'll see. Before we dive in though, I just have to state, I don't necessarily hold all of these opinions myself. I'm presenting the theory and the information and evidence as I understand it. Before you fire off on the keyboard when I mention a couple of these details, just wait till the end, because I will be questioning some of what I'm saying at the start at the end. But it certainly is a theory worth considering. Now, you might remember that name, DiemSchutz, because of the Elizabeth Stride crime scene. He was the first person there. And straight away, some people will say, but that doesn't make you responsible for the crime. Yet many people point to Lechmere, who found the very first official Ripper victim. It's proven that he was on the scene, apparently first, and we've been able to tie all this evidence in around him. Well, can we do the same with this bloke? Is there credible reason to suspect Louis DiemSchutz as being Jack the Ripper? But before we look at DiemSchutz himself, we actually need to consider where his ideologies came from. Now, before we look at DiemSchutz himself, we actually need to see where his ideology came from. Because he was the basically manager, for want of a better term, of that particular club. And they followed the views of Peter Kropotkin. Now, he was a Russian, and his story was interesting. He was born in 1842, and he was born into wealth. His father was like a royal person in the military, so he had servants and everything as he grew up, but his father wasn't around that much. And it said that he actually got attached to the people that worked on the property where he grew up. And it's possibly for that reason that led him to these socialist views. He probably saw the fact that even though he was born into that privileged situation, and these ones looking after him, who he got to probably love, would never achieve that sort of status in life, despite how hardworking and what kind hearts they may have had. So he then probably thought, well, this is not right. Really, the wealth should be shared. Hence, the socialist idea. So when that was being spruiked by people, he jumped on board with it in a big way. Now, without making this a history lesson into Kropotkin, he got involved in some activities, was a big agitator for social change. He got expelled from some countries. He was involved in possibly an assassination attempt on a Russian leader as well. He was a prolific writer, had many pamphlets and books on this subject. And so young, impressionable minds who perhaps saw the very views that were being espoused by Kropotkin probably thought to themselves, well, you know what? That's true. And here comes the International Working Men's Educational Society. DiemSchutz was a Russian immigrant in his mid-20s. He wasn't an old bloke like me. Very impressionable you are at that age too. It doesn't take much for people to influence your views. In fact, many of those who were around that club were similar age and all mostly immigrants, all struggling to make a living. See, DiemSchutz himself was selling costume jewelry to people on the street. He wasn't exactly living a wealthy life. He probably thought, well, I'm working hard. I need some of this action as well. And the condensed housing around Whitechapel and the poverty. And yet the royal family in England lived not too far away. And the general perception that the privileged class in England at the time tried to portray was that everything was just tickety-boo. There's nothing wrong here, despite what many of the people on the street had to cope with. And we can see why that would agitate some strong feelings, particularly with the younger generation coming through. they're probably looking at it. Now, DiemSchutz was married, and he's probably thinking, I'm bringing kids into this society, and what's the future for them? Are they going to have to struggle just the same as I am? Well, that could have been the thinking and the reason why he was a very active member of this club. So right now you are probably wondering, Owen, what on earth does this have to do with Jack the Ripper? Just because this poor bloke coming back from the market finds a body in Dutfield's yard where the club back door was, where it backed into it, what's that got to do with it? Why would he even be on the radar? There's some similarities between this bloke and Lechmere, and some marked differences as well. To begin with, Lechmere did not want any attention. In fact, he just wanted to get away from the policemen when he first saw them and saying, look, you're wanted back there, I'm off to work. He was basically forced to come to the inquest. DiemSchutz, not so much. He, after this event, even posed for some pictures to be drawn. I mean, there weren't any photographs of Dutfield's yard with him standing in it, but he did pose for some sketches to be done of him and how he found the body. So he didn't mind the attention. He also gave some interviews to the press, which I believe Lechmere definitely never did. But what is the evidence that he could have been involved in that crime, at least that first one being Elizabeth Stride? But this theory was written about in a book by Randy Williams called Sherlock Holmes versus the Autumn of Terror, and that is an interesting title, The Autumn of Terror. The Sherlock Holmes is also a bit funny, and I'll say why, because it was written as a fictional novel, and so people straight away discount this theory, saying, but it was fiction. He made it up. Yes, he did make up the Sherlock Holmes part, but a lot of what was written in there, he claims to be fairly solid facts. So let's deep dive the events of that night as they relate to Louis DiemSchutz. It said that he left at 11:30 a.m. to go down to Crystal Palace, and he gets back at 1 a.m. Sunday morning. So he's gone for 13 and a half hours. And that's fair because that was an 8-mile trip down to Crystal Palace. Not only just with a slow horse and cart, he wasn't on a racehorse. You've got to sell what you can sell. And he said he was returning his unsold goods to Dutfield's yard before he took his horse back to George's yard in Cable Street, which I believe is close to where Martha Tabram's crime happened. But that whole trip to Crystal Palace raises a very interesting question. Because Louis DiemSchutz was a devout Jewish person. So he was a Russian Jew. And the Jewish Sabbath goes from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. Was he leaving for business Saturday at 11:30 in the morning? That is an interesting question. No one challenged that, knowing that he was a Jewish person. Why on earth were you traveling for work on the Sabbath? So that there just puts some doubt in our mind about some of what he said. The next thing that gets raised with this theory is you've got a spooked horse that was worried about a body in the yard, and you've left it to go inside to get other people out. And there's no mention that the horse got taken away. We assume that horse stayed in the yard the whole time when there was a big commotion going on. The policeman said he had to get people away from the body because everyone was crowding around and it was a bit of a chaotic scene. Was the horse still in the yard? Because remember, DiemSchutz has run off to find the police. He hasn't taken the horse with him. So did the horse actually get spooked? Particularly knowing it was a horse that was used to being around people if it was going to markets. And then, it wasn't just Louis who ran for the police, but there were 2 other blokes. One bloke by the name of Isaac, can't pronounce his last name, and I think it's Samuel Friedman. They go off in odd directions. They don't head to Commercial Road initially, and that's most likely where you would have found a policeman, but they seem to be just zigzagging and darting around. And it's suggested that the attention that this event got dragged all the police in the area there, and Louis DiemSchutz stayed at that scene after that, but the other two blokes didn't. And this theory suggests that these other two blokes, Isaac and Samuel, then were free to go and commit another crime only 12 to 14 minutes walk away. Because now the police's attention was distracted. So they got into Mitre Square, performed that crime, and took off again, and then planted a knife in Goulston Street, and then wrote that writing on the wall about the Jews. But now you're going to say, but why on earth would they do that? If you were committing these crimes, why would you bring attention to Jewish people by putting that writing on the wall? And why on earth would you do a crime inside your yard just outside of your own club? Well, let me say, people will do very strange things for publicity. Yes, what better way to promote your cause and get people talking about your endeavors than having something happen right outside your establishment? Something controversial. Something that's going to make the front page of the paper. Well, you might think, no, Owen, that's too much of a stretch. Yet, those sorts of things happen today. Like a talk show host doesn't mind if a TV personality gets on there and goes a bit crazy and goes nuts. They'll carry on like it's a terrible thing, but they know their ratings are going to go through the roof. Like if they just get on and talk a normal conversation, no one really watches. They just turn it off. So you have to have something controversial, and then people start tuning in. And this theory actually took it a step further, because it is said that they just didn't do these two crimes. Remember, Randy Williams' book was The Autumn of Terror? He said they were doing these crimes right at the start, and actually points to the Emma Smith crime. And that is horrific what happened to her, but she said it was at least 2 or 3 people that attacked her, and one was a very young man. And Isaac was only 19. And it said that he was like the craziest one amongst them and the most vicious. And that crime, even though she survived the attack itself, she died in the hospital after, but it was just brutal. And it said all these other attacks and murders that were going on were to get the attention brought onto Whitechapel so that people could see what the commoners were going through. It stated that they viewed these ones not as victims, but as martyrs. That in their death, they would serve a greater purpose. And the fact that DiemSchutz had his horse at George's Yard in Cable Street near the Martha Tabram crime apparently, but he changes where that horse was stabled in later interviews with the press. Said, well, no, it was a different George's Yard, which is also odd. But why the writing on the wall about Jews? Well, again, it was to bring the plight of the Jewish people to the fore, because they were saying we're being oppressed here, we're not getting a fair go, and the police are giving us a hard time. And so by people getting to talk about it, well, that would be good. But wasn't it bringing up racial tension? Wasn't there going to be a bit of a civil unrest? Well, yeah, and they wanted that, because the 3 of these blokes, particularly Louis DiemSchutz, got involved only 6 months later in a rally that turned violent, and they were beating up the police. They actually dragged a policeman inside Dutfield's yard and basically had them in the same spot where Elizabeth Stride's body was found and started beating him. And DiemSchutz's wife came out and beat the policeman as well with a broom. So they've gone from running for the police to get help to violently beating them. And he did either 3 months or 6 months in prison, hard labour, because of that assault on the police. There's differing reports how long he served, but the point is he was convicted. Even though crimes happened during that 6 months he was in prison, It's suggested that that was also part of the plan so that the other two members of this little group could go off and commit crimes, and then Louis could not be charged because he was in prison at the time. Now, it sounds fanciful, but it's not as fanciful as some theories on Jack the Ripper, I have to say. It's also said that Kropotkin visited that club in Whitechapel in 1890, and he was in England at the time. So rather than just being 5 victims, did this group from this working men's club commit all these atrocities? Well, I have to state there are some dissenting views here. To start with, we actually really don't know how devout of a Jewish person he was. It's easy to say, oh, he was very devout, but that club seemed more secular than theocratic. People would sing songs, but then didn't seem to have too many like Old Testaments around, just from what I've seen. So it's hard to know if him heading off on Saturday to make some money was any big issue. And people say, but he sold costume jewelry, and Martha Tabram bought some, and so did one of the other Jack the Ripper victims, actually could have been buying jewelry off him, and that is a possibility. But a lot of people were doing that. That wasn't an uncommon thing to do in Whitechapel at the time. And just because 6 months later you turn around and get involved in a scuffle with the police, well, goodness me, look what happened during COVID. I'm only pointing to what happened in Australia with lockdowns and stuff. All of a sudden, people have gone from law-abiding citizens to getting involved in scuffles with the police over lockdowns. An issue could easily rise up, and people's attitude changes very, very quickly. It's not to say that they had this built-up hatred for the police before then. The biggest thing that I have a question mark on is the notion that they ran around everywhere to get the police all into Dutfield's yard so that the other two could run off and commit the crime over in Mitre Square. Yet, when we look at the crime scene of Mitre Square, quite a lot of policemen were around. Yes, it was only a 12-minute walk, but you had a lot of police walking the street back then, because it seems like at least five police officers turned up at that scene in Mitre Square not long after the body was found by P.C. Watkins. So it's not like all the police had gone down to Dutfield's yard. There was still plenty around in that area. And in fact, remember, 45 minutes later, a policeman found that knife and the writing on the wall. And he said previous there was nothing around. I have to say, this theory is a very interesting one from the point of view of my personal opinion on the Jack the Ripper saga. Not in necessarily who was the perpetrator, but the fact that if these guys had done these crimes, the press certainly helped them out by splashing it everywhere in the papers. And whether these guys did the crimes or not, we are still talking about the International Working Men's Educational Society, because the papers publicised that event huge back then. It made national press. There is a lot more to this theory, which I will not go into, because I think the main things have been covered. But I'd be interested to know what you think. Do you think these 3 blokes committed these 2 crimes on that night and committed all these other ones around? Or is it just confirmation bias? A thought where, well, I actually think this guy could have done it, and then trying to fit the evidence on the bloke. I'm not saying that any of us would do that. We're very open-minded and want to dive into the truth so we don't get stuck on one idea necessarily. No, I'm joking. You can have a strong opinion. I have a strong opinion. There's nothing wrong with a strong opinion. Get into it in the comments if you want to. Because in the next video, I think some very strong opinions are going to come out again. Because we have not finished with the double event. There was another event attached to this. Yes, and that's the knife that was found in Galston Street. Some very interesting information about that. So make sure you check out that next video. But thank you very much for watching. It honestly is genuinely appreciated. And thank you for throwing in all those comments too. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, give us a share. I'm Owen. You've been watching the Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.